This brief video is on forms of organization, or the business structures. We're going to talk primarily in this course about corporations, specifically publicly traded corporations will be our focus. But we do need to appreciate and understand that there are other common forms of organization. Let me open up a file. The first type of form of organization that always gets discussed is the simplest, often called mom and pop or sole proprietorship. We have single person ownership. These types of organizations are very easy to launch and form. We have advantages. It's very simple decision making. You don't have to consult partners or boards of directors. You make decisions on your own. The apparatus to put in place involves low organization and operational costs. The biggest problem here is that we have unlimited liability to the owner. You don't have limited liability, as you'll see, at a partner in a corporation. As an example for you, my wife and I launched a business shortly after we were married. That's more than 40 years ago. Being a little young and foolish, we started a small business. Now, the business actually failed. So we lost all of the seed money we put into the business. However, we were fortunate that the product that we had, which we didn't sell much of, but the product we have didn't harm anyone. Had it harmed anyone, then they could have taken legal action against the sole proprietorship, as well as come after all of our individual assets. So if we had owned a home, a car, our own personal checking and banking accounts, then those seeking to pursue us had an unlimited ability to get to all of our assets. So we had unlimited liability. This is the prime disadvantage to being a sole proprietor. Now, with a partnership, it's much like a sole proprietorship, but you're sharing liability as well as ownership interests in any distribution of profits with a partner. So we also have unlimited liability, which is quite a risk. But in this case, you have a partner. So as you make decisions, generate profits, incur losses, these are all shared with a partner, and you have some very well-developed partnership documents that spell out exactly the ownership interests and the responsibilities of each partner. But much like the mom and pop, this has unlimited liability. Now, with a limited partnership, we can have a general partner who has liability, where limited partners have only a liability equal to their investment in the business. So this is a sort of a hybrid between a partnership and a corporation, with the general partner taking on unlimited liability and limited partners having only their investment at risk. What we really want to focus on is the corporation, and this is by far the most dominant form of organization in the country, in the Western world. I don't know about outside the Western world, but this is the form of organization that dominates in terms of revenue, sales, gross domestic product contribution, and those sorts of things. And the reason why this is considered the most favorable form of organization is that you have limited liability. The only thing that's at risk in the corporate format are the corporate assets themselves. So if you were an officer or a member of a corporation, the corporation went bad, say you produced an automobile and it harmed and actually killed many people, for example. The only thing that would be at risk would be the corporate assets. So as unfortunate a situation as you might have with injuring those through your product, the only thing that's at risk is the corporate assets, not your personal assets. There is a disadvantage to corporations, and that would be shown here, and that's the double taxation of earnings. When you have a corporation, you'd like to see corporate earnings go up, but as that happens, the earnings are taxed. and then only with after-tax profits could you have the distribution of a dividend. If you received a dividend from a corporation, then you would also be taxed on the dividends. So that is the prime disadvantage of a corporation, in that the profits are taxed before distribution of a dividend, and then the dividend itself is taxed, so-called double taxation. One other advantage that I failed to mention on the corporation is that it can survive the death of its founder. For instance, Ford Motor Company was founded by Henry Ford. Apple was founded by Steve Jobs. Both of those founders have passed on. However, their corporations survive and can continue on an unlimited basis as long as the board of directors continues to consider the corporation viable and it remains solvent. You need to make sure you're aware of something called agency theory. Agency theory discusses the conflict that owners and managers of firms might have. Let's take Apple, for instance. Tim Cook is the CEO of Apple currently. Apple has a very, very strong balance sheet and repeatable, steady earnings, but not growth. A lot of the saturation of cell phones, iPhones, throughout the consumer causes repeat sales, but a lack of growth. So Tim Cook, who owns a lot of Apple shares, has this great balance sheet. Does he use it to take risk, which might put his own personal fortune at risk? Or does he sort of just man the ship and guide it steadily through a period of stable revenues and stable profits, a more conservative approach? Agency theory points towards the fact that owners and managers of a firm have to navigate this difference between what's best for shareholders and what might be best for them individually. So agency theory is one of those things we encounter under the corporate form of organization. Finally, we get to this slide is on Sarbanes-Oxley. It doesn't have to do with forms of organizations, but it's something we need to study and be aware of. There were many major scandals in the early 2000s that demonstrated that organizations had some poor accounting practices, or maybe auditors were not as strict as they should have been, or as independent and objective as they should have been as they examined financial statements of corporations. For instance, study the case of Enron, study the case of Tyco, look at the Madoff scandal, and you'll find many, many reasons as to why the Sarbanes-Oxley Act was necessary. This establishes something called the PCAOB, which is a public company accounting oversight board, which causes auditors to be audited through a peer review process. It also requires on the corporation something called attestation, where individuals, such as I was in a position with an organization of having to have to sign off on the attestation statement, meaning that I put my personal reputation and personal finances at risk in having signed financial statements of a public an organization not publicly traded, but we had debt that was publicly traded. I signed off on an attestation which said that because of my position, I was in a position to know whether or not the financial statements were true and accurate, and I put my personal reputation behind that. That causes a very serious contemplation by those officers of an organization before they sign off on the financial statements. Signing off and demonstrating that they feel is trust and faithfulness in the reports on assets, liabilities, equity, and income on the financial statements. So that all came about through the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, and which was in response to a lot of corporate scandals. So thank you for listening to this brief video on forms of organization and on the Sarbanes-Oxley Act.